She didn't scream when the blade touched her throat. She chose not to. While the entire Lycan Kingdom slept, while his royal healers wept over a dying king they couldn't save, she descended alone into the ritual chamber, the outcast, the Omega, the woman every noble had laughed at that very morning. And with trembling hands and absolute certainty, she carved the price of his life out of her own flesh. His heartbeat returned before dawn. Her voice never did. Now watch what happens next, because this is where the story gets cruel. The king woke up powerful, arrogant, and completely restored, and the first words from his newly healed lips were a public declaration of disgust toward the silent Omega haunting his halls. He called her useless. His court called her broken. And she stood there, throat scarred beneath her collar, bleeding his secret in silence, too bound by ancient magic to speak the truth, too proud to beg for the mercy she had already paid for with her voice. This is the story of a woman who saved a king who didn't deserve her, and the slow, agonizing, intoxicating unraveling of everything he thought he knew. If this kind of hidden sacrifice and slow-burn desire wrecks you the way it wrecks me, smash that like button, drop a wolf emoji in the comments, share this with someone who loves a good enemies to lovers burn, and subscribe, because we are just getting started. Chapter 1. The Ritual of the Silent Bond. The palace smelled like death that night. Not the clean death of battle, the rotting, festering kind that crawls through a man's blood and extinguishes him slowly, organ by organ, heartbeat by heartbeat. 3 royal healers had already retreated from the king's chamber with ash-white faces and trembling hands. The most powerful Lycan healers in 7 territories had pressed their gifts against his body and found nothing but silence where his life force should have burned. They said it quietly, in the way powerful men announce unbearable things. King Selim was dying, and there was nothing left to be done. They were wrong. But the only person who knew that wasn't allowed in the room. Her name was Sera. And, depending on who you asked in the Driven Palace, she was either invisible or an embarrassment, the Omega girl who had been dragged into the royal court 3 years ago as part of a border pact treaty, a diplomatic afterthought nobody had bothered to rescind. She had no title, no rank worth speaking of. She ate after the servants, slept in a chamber barely larger than a closet, and had long since learned to move through the marble hallways like smoke, present but unnoticed, breathing but not quite alive in any way the court acknowledged. What the court didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Sera carried something in her bloodline older than the Driven throne itself. The Vaelori lineage. Ancient. Unbroken. And the only genetic thread in the known Lycan world capable of weaving the rite of the silent bond. Most people thought the silent bond was mythology. A bedtime story told to frighten young healers away from the darker branches of pack magic. The texts that survived described it in terrifying, clinical language, a spell requiring absolute biological surrender, the permanent sacrifice of the caster's primary sensory vessel, offered willingly and without coercion, in exchange for the complete restoration of a dying alpha's life force. The spell didn't want payment in gold or years or suffering. It wanted permanence. It wanted something you could never get back. For the right to hold, the healer had to sever their own vocal cords. Not damage them. Not strain them past recovery. Sever. Deliberately. Completely. The magic demanded the irrevocability of the act as proof of intention, because the ancient Lycan architects of the spell understood something brutal and true about sacrifice. It only counts if you can't take it back. Sera had known about her lineage since she was 12 years old, when her grandmother pressed a crumbling text into her hands and whispered the kind of warning that lives in your chest for the rest of your life. This gift will ask everything of you one day, little one. And you will have to decide if the person asking is worth the price. She had spent 3 years in Selim court, watching him be magnificent and cruel and magnetic and dismissive in equal measure. She had watched him command a room with nothing but the weight of his posture. She had watched him laugh, rarely, but devastatingly, and felt the sound of it land somewhere deep in her sternum where she had no business feeling anything. She had watched him look through her like glass every single time their paths crossed, his dark eyes sliding past her face as though she were part of the architecture. And she had decided, standing outside his death chamber with a ritual blade in her hand and the entire palace in mourning around her, that he was worth it. God help her, he was worth it. She didn't ask permission. There was no one to ask. She slipped into the chamber through the servants' passage at the back of the room, moving past the unconscious king with the steady, deliberate calm of someone who has already made their peace with what comes next. She didn't look at his face for long. She couldn't afford to. His beauty and unconsciousness was the kind that made you second-guess yourself, the sharp jaw gone slack, the iron tension of his body finally, terribly still, the faint blue tinge of fading life force beginning at the edges of his lips. She looked away, knelt on the cold stone floor, opened the text she'd memorized 100 times in the dark of her tiny room, and began. The rite of the silent bond does not announce itself. There is no dramatic surge of light, no shaking walls, no celestial thunder to mark the moment a woman trades her future for a king's heartbeat. There is only the soft, guttural work of ancient syllables spoken in a language that predates the kingdom by 4 centuries, and the slow, terrible warmth of magic rising up through the caster's chest like something enormous and patient finally being let out of a cage. She felt it reach her throat, felt it press against her vocal cords with a heat that was almost gentle, the way a surgeon's knife is almost gentle, precise and merciless and done before you can fully register the pain. She kept her eyes open. She kept her voice steady through the final words of the incantation. And then she spoke the last syllable she would ever speak. The magic released like a shockwave. The king's chest heaved. His color returned. His heartbeat, that near-silent flutter the healers had reported with grief in their voices, swelled into a full, powerful rhythm that she could feel in the marble beneath her knees. Selim Dreven breathed, deep and strong and furious with life, as if his body was angry at having been so close to the edge. Sera pressed her fingers lightly against her own throat. Already, the scar tissue was forming beneath her skin, quick and clean the way Lycan healing always worked, sealing the wound, preserving the sacrifice, making it permanent in the time it took her to exhale. She gathered her things, moved back through the servants' passage, and disappeared into the dark of the palace before a single soul stirred. She never made a sound, because she no longer could. If you already feel the weight of what she just gave up, drop a wolf face in the comments. This story is just beginning. Chapter 2: The Weight of the King's Recovery. He was magnificent in his recovery. That was the cruelest part. Selim Dreven did not convalesce the way ordinary men did, pale and grateful and humbled by their near death. He rose from his sickbed with the terrifying vitality of someone whose body had been rebuilt from the inside out, his strength returning not gradually but in a single decisive wave that had his guards and healers alike stepping back in something close to reverent shock. Within 72 hours, he was back on the throne. Within a week, he was riding the territory borders on horseback, reasserting his presence to the pack the way alpha kings always did, through sheer, undeniable physicality. The court celebrated his recovery as a miracle. The royal healers accepted quiet congratulations for their work despite knowing, privately and shamefully, that none of them had done a single thing. There were whispered theories. Divine favor. The king's own preternatural will to survive. A spontaneous remission of the bloodline curse that had almost killed him. Nobody looked at the Omega girl who had stopped speaking. The first time Sera heard his voice again, really heard it, from across a crowded throne room where she was carrying a water pitcher for one of the senior staff, she had to stop walking. Had to breathe through the way his baritone landed in her chest like a key in a lock she hadn't known was there. He was addressing his council about border security, his dark eyes sharp and focused, every inch of him electric with restored authority. He had never looked more alive. She had made him that way, with the last words she would ever speak. He didn't look at her. Not once. She was furniture. The political machinery of the court had resumed with his recovery, and at its center was a question that apparently consumed everyone of importance: the matter of the king's Luna. Selim was 34, unmatched, and the pack's stability required an heir. The noble families had been circling this vacancy for years, and his miraculous survival had only intensified the urgency. Names were floated in every corridor. Daughters of allied alphas. Highborn she-wolves with impressive lineages and carefully curated social graces. Women who could speak at royal dinners and hold court without incident. The contrast was not subtle, and it was not accidental. Sera felt it in the sidelong looks of the court ladies when she passed. She felt it in the way the king's beta, a broad-shouldered wolf named Darian who had never particularly liked her, began finding administrative reasons to assign her increasingly menial work. Laundry. Kitchen prep. The kind of labor designed to communicate, without ever needing to say it directly, you are less than you were, and you were never much to begin with. What she could not have prepared herself for was the afternoon she heard the king say it out loud. She had been folding linens in the corridor outside the council chamber when his voice carried through the heavy door. Not raised, not heated, just that deep, casually authoritative tone he used for all matters of administrative fact. She heard Darian's voice first, asking something she couldn't make out. And then Selim, clear as a bell and twice as cold. The Omega? The mute one? She contributes nothing to this court. If she cannot perform her basic function, she has no purpose being housed here at the palace's expense. A pause. Darian, quieter, she's technically covered under the border treaty. Then find her something useful to do in the servants' quarters and keep her out of the formal halls. I won't have the court's dignity undermined by, and here, a dismissive exhale, whatever she is. Sera set down the linen she was holding very carefully. Her hands were not shaking. She made sure of that. She pressed her fingers once against the soft hollow of her throat, felt the smooth ridge of healed scar tissue beneath her skin, and breathed through the specific, exquisite agony of hearing herself described as a liability by the man whose heart she had literally restarted with her sacrifice. She did not cry. She was not permitted that luxury. Because the rite of the silent bond carried a secondary covenant that the romance of the myth always conveniently omitted. The spell's integrity depended on the caster's silence, not just physical, but intentional. If Sera found another way to communicate the truth of what she had done, if she wrote it down or gestured it, or found any mechanism to tell the king what his survival had cost her, the spell would unravel. Not gradually. Immediately and completely. His restored life force would collapse. He would die, not from the original wound, but from the withdrawal of magic that had now integrated fully into his cellular structure. She couldn't tell him. Not ever. Not without killing him. So she carried the scars and the silence and the weight of his contempt, and she moved herself quietly to the servants' quarters as instructed, and she learned the specific geography of the ache that comes from loving someone who looks at you like you're already gone. Chapter 3. The Agony of the Mockery. The court found her silence hilarious. Not immediately in the first weeks of the king's recovery. The palace was too consumed with celebration and political maneuvering to pay much attention to a voiceless Omega in the back corridors. But as the weeks settled into routine and the novelty of Selim's survival faded into institutional memory, boredom reasserted itself in the way it always does among people with too much power and not enough conscience. Lady Vexeracroft noticed her first. The eldest daughter of the Western Alpha, 26 and devastating in the specific way of women who have been told their whole lives that cruelty is charisma. She spotted Sera carrying a tray of bread rolls through the great hall one morning and called out to her in a voice pitched to carry, "Oh look, the little mute is fetching for us now." How perfectly appropriate. The laughter that followed was the kind that fills stone halls and echoes long after the perpetrators have moved on to their next entertainment. What made it surgical was the way Sera could not respond. Every other target of court ridicule had the option of a sharp retort, a quiet dignity expressed through words, some mechanism of reclamation. Sera had only her face, and she had learned to make her face into marble, which the court interpreted not as strength, but as vacancy, further evidence, in their minds, that there was nothing of substance beneath the surface. The king witnessed 3 separate incidents. Sera documented this internally with the precision of someone who has nothing to do but observe, because observation was what she had left. The first time, he was crossing the hall with Darian and glanced toward the sound of laughter with the mild curiosity of a man checking the weather. His gaze swept across the scene, Vexera's circle, the fallen tray, Sera on her knees collecting bread from the stone floor, and he looked away without breaking stride. The second time, he was closer, close enough that she could smell the cedar and iron scent of him that she had noticed exactly once before, in the dark of his death chamber. And he met her eyes for approximately 2 seconds before his jaw set, and he turned away, as if looking too long at something uncomfortable. The third time was different. Vexera had escalated, the way bullies always do when the target refuses to break. She had waited until Sera was delivering fresh water to the council anteroom and deliberately knocked the basin from her hands, sending it shattering across marble. The cold water spreading in a wide arc that soaked the hem of Sera's dress and drew every eye in the corridor. The laughter was immediate and loud. Vexera's voice rose above it. Someone should muzzle the creature before she causes more damage. Though I suppose she's already done that herself. The king was 15 feet away. He turned at the sound of the crash. His dark eyes moved from the shattered basin to Vexera's satisfied smile to Sera, kneeling in the cold water, collecting ceramic shards with the careful, methodical movements of someone who is controlling their hands because it is the only thing they can control. And something shifted in his face, not pity, not recognition, not the thing she might have let herself want. Just a flicker of something unreadable, a momentary disturbance in the cold water of his expression, there and gone so fast she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. Lady Vexera. His voice was quiet. The corridor went still. That is enough. Vexera blinked. My lord, I was only. I said enough. He did not help Sera up. He did not acknowledge her directly. He simply moved through the corridor and disappeared, leaving silence behind him like a tide going out. But Vexera's smile had curdled, and nobody in that corridor laughed again that afternoon. Sera filed this away in the private archive of observations she kept in place of the voice she no longer had. It meant nothing, she told herself. Pragmatic kings don't like disorder in their corridors. It wasn't about her. She was almost convinced. If this slow burn is already getting under your skin, share this video with someone who needs a good story. You know who they are. What she could not share with anyone was the war happening inside her. Because the ache of his dismissal was one thing. The ache of wanting him of still, after everything, feeling that soul-deep gravitational pull toward him every time he entered a room, was a different beast entirely, and it fed on her silence like fire on oxygen. She couldn't speak the desire away. Couldn't argue herself out of it in a journal entry or confide it to a friend over a glass of wine. It lived in her chest, warm and persistent and infuriating, and it intensified rather than faded as the weeks accumulated, as though her sacrifice had not diminished her connection to him but deepened it. She chose, daily, to honor the spell. To protect him. To carry the truth alone. Whether that was strength or stubbornness, she had long since stopped being able to tell. Chapter 4. The Fraying Secrets of the Pack. It was the blood scent that started it. Darian had spent 11 years as the king's beta, and in that time he had developed the particular professional skill of a man who watches over someone powerful, the ability to notice when things don't add up, and the patience to wait until they do. He had been puzzled, privately and quietly, by the king's recovery since the first morning. Not by the fact of it, miracles happened in packs with old bloodlines, he'd seen enough to stop being surprised, but by the texture of it. The specific quality of restored life force that didn't feel like spontaneous remission or divine intervention, but rather like something given. Something transferred. He first noticed the blood scent connection during a routine patrol report 6 weeks after the recovery. He had been standing close to the king when a draft moved through the throne room from the direction of the servants' corridor, and carried on that draft, threaded through the king's familiar cedar and iron signature, was the faint, unmistakable resonance of a second magic. Old magic. The kind that predates formal training and academy protocol. The kind that smells to a beta who knows what he's looking for, like a healing bond improperly sealed. He didn't say anything. He started watching. The Omega girl's silence had nagged at him from the beginning, but he had dismissed it as psychological damage. The palace was not gentle to those without status, and he had seen plenty of Omegas retreat inward under sustained social pressure. But then he started noticing the timing. The silence had begun the same night as the king's fever break. Not the day after. Not the week after. The same night, verified by cross-referencing the servant rosters, which recorded that Sera had been present at the palace at midnight and absent from all evening duties, and that she had stopped speaking so abruptly that the kitchen staff had assumed she'd suffered some kind of acute illness. He pulled the ancient healing texts from the restricted archive on a Tuesday afternoon, telling no one why. He found the Rite of the Silent Bond on page 211. Read it 3 times. Sat very still in the archive for a long time after, doing the math of what a girl with the right bloodline would have had to do, willingly, alone, in the dark, to pull a dying king back from the edge that every trained healer had already declared uncrossable. He pressed his knuckles against his mouth. Closed the book. Felt the specific, nauseating weight of a man who has been complicit in cruelty without knowing it. The king felt it before he understood it. That was the most honest accounting of what was happening to Selim Dreven in the weeks following his recovery, something happening in him that preceded his comprehension of it, working on him from below the level of conscious thought with the slow, irresistible pressure of an underground river finding cracks in stone. It started with the dreams. He never remembered the content, only the atmosphere, warmth, a quality of presence beside him in the dark, something that felt ancient and specific and chosen in a way he couldn't articulate upon waking. He would lie in the gray pre-dawn of his chamber and press his hand to his chest, feeling the scar that had formed over the site of his original wound, a mark that his healers had noted with puzzlement was shaped less like a wound scar and more like a seal. Deliberate. Geometric in its clean edges. He began noticing her. He tried, initially, to frame this as administrative concern. She was a treaty obligation. Her presence in the servant quarters represented a security variable. These were the stories he told himself in the rational, organized parts of his mind. But rationality has a poor survival rate against the Lycan soul pull, and what he felt when she entered his peripheral vision was not administrative. It was tectonic. She moved through his palace like someone who had learned not to exist too loudly, and yet he tracked her with a precision that alarmed him whenever he caught himself doing it. The angle of her jaw when she concentrated on a task. The way her hands moved, deliberate, elegant, quiet, as if they had developed their own vocabulary to replace the one she'd lost. The fact that she never looked at him with need or hope or resentment. She looked at him with a calm steadiness that unsettled him deeply, because he could not identify the category it belonged to. He found himself replaying the corridor incident with Vexera. Replaying it not as a matter of keeping court order, but as a specific memory. The image of Sera kneeling in spilled water, collecting shards, her face composed into that impenetrable stillness. There was something in her eyes in that moment that he couldn't shake. Not defeat. Not anger. Something far more unnerving. She had looked at him the way someone looks at a thing they have already decided about. Completely. Irrevocably. He didn't know what she had decided, and it was beginning to consume him. Then Darian came to him on a Thursday evening, quietly, and asked to speak privately about a matter concerning the king's recovery. and the careful political architecture of Selim-driven certainty about himself and his court began, at last, to crack. Chapter 5. The Revelation of the Bloody Debt. Darian did not soften it. He had known the king for 11 years and understood that he was a man who processed brutal truth better than careful delivery. He laid it out clean, the blood-scent evidence, the text, the timing, the biological markers of a Vaelori casting preserved in the king's own restored life force like a fingerprint pressed into wax. He did not interpret it. He did not editorialize. He read from the ancient text, placed it open on the king's desk, and stepped back. Selim read it twice. The room was very quiet. The vocal cords. His voice, when he finally spoke, was strange. Flat in a way Darian had never heard from him. The spell requires a permanent severance. Yes. Darian paused. Voluntary. Complete. Done the same night your fever broke. The king stood from his desk. Walked to the window. Stood there for a long time looking out over the moonlit territory, and Darian watched his shoulders move with the slow, controlled breathing of a man who is holding something enormous very still so it doesn't destroy the room. She was in my chamber. Yes. Alone. While everyone else. Yes. Another long silence. Darian counted his own heartbeats. I called her useless. The words came out stripped of all inflection. I said it in the council chamber. I had her moved to the servants' quarters. A pause. She stood in the corridor while Vexera, he stopped. Started again. She was carrying my laundry and she had already. He couldn't finish the sentence. Darian didn't try to fill the silence for him. Get out. Quietly. Please. He found her at midnight. She was in the small herb garden at the back of the east wing, the one place in the palace that seemed, by Darian's observation, to belong to her in any meaningful sense, the one spot she returned to when the weight of the court became too much. She was sitting on the low stone bench beneath the moonflowers, her dark hair loose, her face tipped slightly upward toward the cold night air, and she heard him coming 20 feet out because she always heard him. Her whole body oriented toward him the way plants orient toward light, involuntarily, helplessly, and with the particular quality of something that has been doing it for so long it no longer registers the act. She looked at him when he stopped in front of her. Her eyes were steady. Her hands, folded in her lap, were still. He looked at her throat. She watched him look. She did not move or cover herself or turn away. She let him see what was there, the thin, faint line of healed scar tissue at the hollow of her neck, the mark that his survival had pressed permanently into her body. She had spent months keeping it hidden. She didn't hide it now. Selim-driven, king of the Driven pack, descended on one knee in the cold grass before her. She felt the shock of it pass through her like electricity, this man, who had never bent a knee to anything, folding himself down to her level in the dark of the garden, as if the gravity of what she had done had simply overcome his spine. He reached out, stopped short of touching her. His hand hovered near her throat, not touching, just near, and the warmth of it reached her skin with the intensity of something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. Why, he said, hoarse. She held his gaze, reached into the small pocket of her dress and withdrew the single thing she had allowed herself, a folded piece of paper she had written months ago and carried ever since, telling herself she would burn it, knowing she never would. She pressed it into his hand. He unfolded it. Read the single line she had written in the shaking handwriting of someone who knew it was the last thing they'd commit to paper on this subject. Because the pack needed its king. And I was the only one who could. He looked up from the paper. His face, that face she had memorized in its cold magnificence without ever meaning to, was undone. The architecture of it was the same, but the inhabitant behind it was someone she hadn't seen before. Raw, devastated, stripped of every defense mechanism that had kept him navigable and distant and safe from her. I have been, he started. Stopped. Tried again. What I said to you. In the hall. What I allowed. The words seemed to be costing him something significant. Good, said the small surviving piece of her that was allowed to feel angry. There is nothing I can offer that constitutes. She pressed her fingers lightly to his lips. Stopped him. He went very still under her touch. She felt his exhale against her fingertips, warm and shaking. She shook her head slowly. Not forgiving him, not yet, not so easily, she owed herself that much. But telling him, with the eloquence of silence that had become her only language, that she had not done what she'd done to be repaid or acknowledged or thanked. She had done it because she had chosen him. Completely. Irrevocably. His hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his lips. He held it there, pressing her palm to his face with a carefully restrained grip, as if he was afraid of his own strength. His eyes, those dark eyes that had looked through her for years, were looking at her now with an intensity that she felt in the base of her throat, where the scar was, where his life lived inside her sacrifice. I need you to know, he said, very quietly, against her palm, that I feel it. What you left in me. He pressed her hand harder against his face. I have felt it every night since I woke up, and I didn't know what it was, and it was, he exhaled again. It was you. It's been you. The moonflowers moved above them in the cold night air, and the palace breathed its sleeping breath around them. And Selim Dreven stayed kneeling in the cold grass with his king's pride discarded somewhere behind him and his face pressed into the hand of the woman who had bought his life with hers. He didn't move until she let him. She made him wait. She thought she deserved that much. Epilogue: the soul of the pack. The truth came out the way all palace secrets eventually do, in fragments, then in a flood. Darien told the council. The council told the noble houses. The noble houses, with the particular velocity of people desperate to be on the right side of a story that has already tipped, reversed their positions on the Omega Girl with a unanimity that would have been impressive if it weren't so nakedly self-serving. Vexera Croft left court within the month, departing to the Western Territories under circumstances that were never officially clarified but understood by everyone. Sera did not witness most of this. She was busy with other things. The king made no formal announcement. He didn't need to. In the Lycan world, a king's intentions are communicated through proximity and attention, and Selim began spending his evenings in the herb garden where the moonflowers grew, bringing documents to review so he had a reason to be there. Talking to Sera in a way that he had apparently needed to learn from scratch, without the benefit of her responses, forced to listen more carefully than he ever had in his life. Reading her face and her hands, and the particular quality of her silences within. Attention that was, in itself, a form of reparation. He learned her language slowly and without complaint. He asked the healers if anything could be done for her voice. They told him, gently, because they feared him, and then directly, because he needed the truth, that the severance was permanent. The Rite had sealed it that way by design. There was no restoration. There was no reversal. He sat with that for a long time. She watched him carry it, the weight of what her silence cost her translated into something he now bore alongside her. She did not comfort him about it. Some truths deserve to be felt. What she would tell you if she could and she can't, which is the point, which is the whole terrible and beautiful point, is that the voice she lost was not the most important thing she had. She would tell you that she discovered entire vocabularies in his hands when they finally, tentatively found her face. That she discovered whole dialects in the way he cleared a room when she was tired, in the way he positioned himself between her and every corridor that had ever laughed at her, in the way he looked at her now, as if she was the permanent fixed point in a turning world, the thing he oriented toward without meaning to and could no longer imagine navigating without. The pack began calling her something, in the quiet way packs name things that matter. Not the mute Omega. Not the outcast girl. Not the treaty obligation in the servant quarters. They called her the Silent Queen. And in their mouths, the word silent had stopped meaning absence. It had started meaning choice. Strength. The specific, irreversible power of a woman who paid for something with everything she had and never once asked to be thanked. The Lycan King, for his part, spent the rest of his reign learning the art of listening. It was, those who knew him well agreed, the most important thing he ever learned. That's the story of the outcast Omega who saved a king with the last words she would ever speak and found in silence a love more powerful than anything words could have built. If this story moved you, and I think it did, hit that like button and let the algorithm know this kind of storytelling deserves to be seen. Share this video with someone who loves a slow burn that actually pays off. And subscribe, because we tell these stories every single week, the ones with real heat, real ache, and real heart. See you in the next one.